There's a particular stillness to Thursday evenings in Willow Creek, a kind of hush that drapes itself over the town like an old quilt, frayed but familiar. From my kitchen window, I could see the long shadows stretching across the lawn, the neighbor's porch light flickering to life, and Eli's beat-up sedan easing into the driveway with that familiar uneven hum. He always came around dinner time, like clockwork, not for the food, though he pretended it was my roast chicken that lured him, but for the comfort, I think, for the way the house smelled like cinnamon and lemon oil, for the quiet. That evening, I had set 2 plates without thinking. My hands still remembered the rhythm, even when my mind wandered. Eli stepped inside, shaking off the late spring rain, grinning like he had news. "Guess who finally asked Brooke out," he said, unzipping his damp hoodie. I smiled, not because I knew who Brooke was, but because the joy in his voice made the walls feel younger. We sat. We ate. He talked about classes, about professors who played guitar during lectures, about his mom Rachel's new window display at the flower shop. Then, halfway through his second helping of mashed potatoes, he said, "By the way, what are you wearing to the engagement dinner?" I paused, fork midway to my mouth. "What engagement dinner?" Eli blinked. "Uncle Nathan and Heather's. Saturday night at Teller's. Private room and everything. Mom said they sent you an invite." "No," I said slowly, setting the fork down. "No one mentioned anything to me." He frowned, looking genuinely puzzled. "Weird. Dad told me he'd pick you up himself. He said you wanted to wear that blue dress you wore to Grandpa's retirement party." The blue dress. I hadn't worn it in years. It hung at the far end of my closet, still smelling faintly of mothballs and talcum powder. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said quietly, forcing a smile. "Maybe the plans changed." Eli looked down at his plate. Maybe. He didn't press. He never did. After he left, I sat in the living room with the lamp on low and the old clock ticking like it had something to prove. I didn't feel angry, just unsteady. Like the floor beneath me had shifted an inch to the left. I reached for the phone. Nathan answered on the 3rd ring, his voice too bright, too polished. "Hey, Mom. Just calling to say, Heather's under the weather, so we're postponing the engagement dinner. Nothing serious, just a flu. We'll reschedule soon." I said all the things a mother's supposed to say. "That's too bad. Hope she rests. Let me know if you need soup." He thanked me, briefly, then hung up. I sat there listening to the silence, letting it wrap around my shoulders like a damp shawl. I'd heard lies before, but this one didn't even bother to disguise itself. It didn't come from carelessness. It came from decision. They had planned something. They had shared it with others. They had excluded me. On purpose. And I wasn't sure why just yet, but I was sure of one thing. They hadn't forgotten me. They had removed me. I woke the next morning before the light. Sleep had come in patches, restless and shallow, like something borrowed and never quite returned. I sat by the window, watching the fog roll in from the east hills, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea I couldn't taste. I kept going over Eli's words, the way he'd mentioned that blue dress as if it had already been chosen for me, as if plans had been made and my presence had been assumed. There had been no pause in his voice, no doubt. He truly believed I'd been invited. That meant Nathan had told him a version of the story where I belonged at the table, the version I was never given. I didn't feel betrayed in the way novels describe it. No fire, no sting, no need to cry into my sleeves. It was quieter than that, more like watching a door close from the inside and realizing no one was coming back through it. I thought of Heather, poised and polished in every photo Nathan sent, her filtered life lined up in perfect squares on social media. I had tried early on to make conversation when she came around. I had offered recipes, old books, even asked about her parents, but her smile never reached her eyes. She nodded through our talks like she was waiting for a better audience. The morning dragged, and I moved through it with muscle memory, folding towels, watering the succulents, sorting through the mail. Around noon, I decided to call Rachel. I didn't want an explanation. I wanted to hear what she would say when the question wasn't prepared in advance. Her voice was clipped when she answered, caught in the middle of something else. "Mom," she said, "everything okay?" "I was just wondering," I replied, steady as I could, "how Heather's feeling." There was a beat of silence. I'm not sure. Why?" "Nathan said she was sick, that they postponed the engagement dinner." Another pause. Not long, but loud enough to notice. "Oh," she said slowly. "Right, yeah, that. I hadn't heard the latest." I let her stumble. I let her redirect. She said something about needing to go, a customer waiting at the counter, and promised to call me back. She didn't. I didn't expect her to. I spent that evening going through a stack of old photo albums I kept in the living room cabinet. Some were frayed at the corners, the pages curling at the edges, but the colors had held surprisingly well. There was one photo, Nathan, at 6, missing 2 front teeth, arms thrown wide in front of a half-melted snowman, and another, Rachel, in a red velvet dress at her piano recital, looking sideways at her brother like she already knew life would never be fair. And in every third picture, Robert stood in the background, hands in his pockets, a quiet anchor. He had built this house for us, with hands that were always covered in dust. He never said much, but he made everyone feel steadier just by being there. Since he passed, the weight of holding everything together had shifted, and I had tried, in my own quiet ways, to keep the lines from fraying. I had not seen it unravel, not like this. The next day, I went to pick up lemons from the market, a task I didn't need, but gave myself anyway. Sometimes the act of being in motion helps the ache settle into something bearable. That's when I ran into Jeanette, a woman I'd known since our children were in 2nd grade. She was standing by the flower stand, smelling a cluster of peonies, her silver hair pulled back with a pencil, like always. "Irene," she said, bright-eyed, "big weekend coming up, huh?" I looked at her, unsure how much she knew. "Nathan's engagement," she said, answering her own assumption. "Heather came in for arrangements yesterday, said it's going to be lovely. Private room at Teller's. Rachel even took the evening off." She tilted her head slightly. "Aren't you going too?" I didn't lie. I just said, "Plans changed." Jeanette nodded, sensing more than I gave. We talked a few more minutes about weather, her knees, my tomatoes, and then parted. But I didn't walk straight home. I sat on a bench near the post office, watching people go by, holding a bag with lemons I no longer cared to squeeze. So it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion or last-minute chaos. They had made arrangements. Rachel had helped with the flowers. Nathan had confirmed a reservation. Heather had chosen to pretend I wasn't part of the circle that raised her future husband. And Eli, sweet, unaware Eli, was left with the version of truth they felt safest telling. When I got home, I stood in front of my closet and reached for the navy dress. I hadn't worn it since Robert's memorial. The fabric still smelled faintly of cedar and memory. I laid it across the bed and looked at it for a long time. I didn't know yet what I would do. I just knew I couldn't sit home and pretend again. Not this time. The navy dress stayed folded across the bed for 2 days. I didn't put it on. Not yet. I just let it sit there, the fabric soft and undisturbed, as if it were waiting for me to decide what kind of story I wanted to live in. There's a certain kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from knowing too much and not speaking it. That's what the house felt like, full of knowledge no one wanted to admit. I moved carefully through it, as though I could disturb something delicate just by walking too fast. Saturday morning came with a haze over Willow Creek. The light from the windows had that flat, gray quality that made everything feel suspended in time. I had made no plans to attend the dinner, not officially. I hadn't RSVP'd, hadn't called anyone, I wasn't invited. And still, the idea of staying home, alone, pretending I believed the lie they told me, it sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't shift. I dusted the mantel, wiped the kitchen counters, watered the jade plant in the corner, all the usual rhythms, but each task felt like a distraction I'd outgrown. By early afternoon, I found myself reaching for a notepad I kept by the phone. I began writing a list, not of errands or groceries, but of questions I'd stopped asking. When did Nathan start making decisions about me without me? When did Rachel become a visitor instead of a daughter? When did being quiet turn into being irrelevant? I didn't answer them. I just wrote them down and folded the page neatly into my purse. Around 4, I changed into the dress. It still fit, though I could feel how my body had changed since the last time I wore it. The sleeves were a little looser, the zipper a bit easier. I added a thin pearl necklace, not for beauty, but for steadiness. Robert had given it to me on our 30th anniversary, saying it was something simple that would last longer than most words. At 4:45, I called for a cab. The young man who picked me up had music playing too loudly and smelled faintly of cologne and fries. He didn't ask questions, just nodded when I gave him the name of the restaurant. When we pulled up, I didn't ask him to leave. I simply said, "Could you wait here a few minutes, just in case?" He nodded again, not unkindly, and went back to scrolling his phone. I walked around the side of the building, not toward the front entrance, but the small parking lot where I could see the cars. Nathan's sedan, always too clean, too polished. Rachel's SUV with the chipped bumper I had offered to fix last winter. Heather's leased electric car, gleaming under a street lamp not yet lit. And there, tucked near the end, Eli's Honda. All of them were here, not one missing. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't about crashing something I wasn't invited to. I didn't want a scene. I wanted to see, with my own eyes, the story they had written without me. I stood by the side window a while, half hidden behind the shrubs. The curtains were drawn just enough to leave a gap. Inside, a round table glowed under warm lighting, surrounded by the faces I had once known better than anyone. Nathan stood at the head of the table, raising a glass. Heather beside him in red, laughing quietly. Rachel smiling at something Eli had just said. They looked like a family celebrating something honest, but it wasn't. Not to me. I adjusted the clasp on my necklace and stepped back. My legs didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. I walked calmly to the front entrance, where a host in a dark vest met me with a rehearsed smile. I told him my name, not as an introduction, but as a statement. "I'm Irene Dillard," I said, "mother of the groom." He paused, uncertain, then glanced toward the banquet list. Before he could ask more, a voice from behind him called my name. I turned. It took me a moment to recognize him. A little older now, hair silvered at the sides, but the eyes were the same. Thomas Langston. He had lived 2 doors down when our kids were young, had eaten my cinnamon rolls off paper plates in our kitchen, had once cried when I read him The Secret Garden on a rainy day. "Irene," he said, stepping forward, "you haven't changed a bit." I smiled at that. "Oh, but I have." He looked at me for a moment, understanding something without needing it explained. Then he offered his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Shall we?" he said. And together we walked toward the room full of people who had written me out of their story, unaware I still held the pen. The moment Thomas opened the door, the sound inside shifted. It wasn't abrupt or loud, just a hush, soft but undeniable, the way a breeze stills right before a summer storm. I stepped in with him beside me, my hand still resting on his arm. The lights inside the room were golden and flattering, the kind reserved for moments meant to be photographed. A few glasses clinked as they were lowered mid-toast. Conversation faded like music turned down too quickly. I didn't stop walking. I didn't look for permission. I already knew they hadn't planned for me. That was the entire point. Nathan was the first to see me. He stood at the far end of the room, still holding his champagne flute. His expression collapsed in a single breath. He blinked, blinked again, then dropped his hand as if the glass had become too heavy. Heather turned slowly, her posture stiffening just enough to make the neckline of her red dress shift awkwardly. Rachel, caught mid-sip, lowered her wine and looked away, then back again, unsure whether to smile or pretend not to see me at all. I scanned the table without rushing. There were faces I didn't recognize, colleagues probably, or Heather's carefully curated friends. They sat frozen in polite confusion. But then my eyes found Eli, seated near the end, his tie crooked, his plate still half full. He stood so quickly, his chair scraped against the tile. For a second, he looked like a child again, caught between guilt and relief. I offered him the faintest nod. He didn't sit. Nathan finally moved. He stepped around the table, adjusting his blazer as though that would give him the ground back beneath his feet. "Mom," he said, his voice higher than usual, "you're here. We thought you weren't feeling up to it." I let his words sit between us like steam from a dish gone cold. I didn't answer right away. I looked at Heather, at Rachel, at the empty chair beside Eli. "I feel fine," I said calmly. "Healthy enough to attend the dinner you said didn't exist." Heather flinched. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. She felt better today. We didn't know if we should call everyone again. I tilted my head slightly. "But you did. You called everyone else." He didn't deny it. He just stood there, blinking, as if waiting for someone to hand him a better excuse. Rachel stayed in her seat, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Thomas, still standing beside me, gestured quietly to the empty chair. I sat down. No one stopped me. No one welcomed me either. I folded my hands in my lap. I didn't touch the water glass, didn't reach for the bread plate. I looked at my son, my daughter, the woman who would become a permanent fixture in this family, and said what I needed to say, not with volume, but with clarity. "I didn't come to interrupt," I said. "I came to see. I needed to know this wasn't a misunderstanding, that I hadn't been forgotten by accident." Nathan began to speak, but I lifted one hand slightly, and he stopped. I reached into my purse and placed a single white envelope on the table. It made no sound, but every eye followed its movement. "Since you've already drawn the line," I continued, "I thought I'd bring a few things of my own." The envelope wasn't thick. It didn't need to be. I opened it with care, sliding out the documents one by one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for their reactions. I simply explained, like narrating a weather report for a storm that had already passed. "The house," I began, "was sold 3 days ago, the one you've both been asking me to consider transferring early. It's no longer mine. A young couple with 2 small children will move in next month. They loved the garden, said it reminded them of someone's grandmother." Rachel's jaw dropped slightly. Nathan's mouth parted, but no sound came. "The proceeds," I continued, placing the second sheet on the table, "have already been donated to the Willow Creek Children's Library. They're using the funds to build a new literacy wing. It will bear Robert's name. He believed in books more than property, anyway." There was a rustle at the far end of the table. Someone dropped a napkin. No one moved to pick it up. "And this," I said, laying down the final page, "is my updated will. What little I have left, personal belongings, savings, whatever remains, will go to Eli." He stood a little straighter, not proud, not smug, just still. Everyone else looked anywhere but at me. I didn't lean back. I didn't fold my arms. I let the quiet do its work. I had not raised my voice. I had not asked for anything. But they understood. They had set the table. They had chosen the guest list. They had omitted one seat, and I had walked in anyway. They didn't know what to say, not because they lacked words, but because every word they might have chosen had already been proven false by my presence. I could see it in their faces, the confusion of being caught, the scramble of trying to decide whether to explain, to apologize, or to wait it out and hope I'd leave quietly. But I didn't move. I stayed in that chair between Eli and a young woman I didn't recognize, my purse resting neatly in my lap, the documents laid out like a quiet ledger of what no longer belonged to them. Eli looked at me, then at the will, his expression unreadable, but his hand moved slightly toward mine as if to anchor me there. I didn't pull away. I let the gesture rest between us like a small thread in a room unraveling. Nathan finally stepped forward, resting his hands on the back of a chair across from me. He looked smaller than usual, not in size, but in stature. His voice was low and too careful. "Mom," he began, "I think we should talk, privately. This doesn't need to happen here." I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch just enough for the tension to settle into something visible. I wanted them to feel it. Not the shame, not the loss, just the quiet certainty that I was no longer operating by their rhythm. When I spoke, it wasn't to argue. "You've done enough explaining," I said, "and I've listened long enough. This is not a discussion. It's a decision, one that's already been made." Heather looked down at her plate. Rachel kept her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, fingers tracing a pattern that wasn't there. The room was too still for a celebration, too heavy for joy. A server entered, paused at the shift in atmosphere, and exited again without saying a word. Rachel finally spoke. Her voice was thin, barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean to hurt you." It would have been easier if she had shouted, if someone had slammed a glass or thrown blame, but soft denials sting in a different way. They ask to be forgiven without being accountable. I turned to her, steady. "But you did. You chose to lie. Not once, not in passing. You created an entire event and built it without me. That's not oversight. That's erasure." She didn't deny it. She just stared at her hands as if searching for something she had once held and lost without realizing. I stood. The fabric of my dress shifted as I rose, and for a brief moment, the sound of it was the only thing in the room. I felt taller than I had in years, not in the way people measure height, but in the way a person stands when they are no longer trying to be small. "You've taught me something," I said, looking at each of them, not to shame, but to finish what needed finishing. "You've taught me that love without dignity is not love. It's convenience, and I have no use for that anymore." I turned to Eli, who hadn't said a word since I arrived. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen on any other face in that room. Regret, yes, but also clarity. I rested my hand gently on his shoulder. "You stay," I said. "You belong here. Not because of blood or names, but because you never stopped showing up." He nodded once. No words needed. I looked around the room one last time, not to take anything with me, but to confirm what I was leaving behind. There were no pleas, no last-minute gestures, just silence, stretched thin over a truth they hadn't prepared to confront. Thomas was waiting near the door, still standing, hands folded in front of him. When I reached him, he didn't speak. He just opened the door, letting the night air rush in around us like a new breath. The wind carried the scent of rosemary and roast lamb, but it didn't pull me back. It pushed me forward. The taxi was still there, engine humming gently under the dim parking lot lights. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Every step away from that restaurant felt lighter, not because I had won anything, but because I had stopped trying to keep something alive that had already been laid to rest. Inside the car, I sat quietly, hands folded over my purse. The documents were still inside. But the real shift had already happened. They had drawn the map. I had simply walked off the edge of it, and in doing so, I had found something they hadn't expected, myself, intact and unshaken. As the driver turned back onto Main Street, the lights of Willow Creek flickered past the window. I saw the old bookstore, the faded church steeple, the community hall where Robert and I once slow danced during winter socials. I wasn't mourning what I left. I was honoring what I had chosen not to carry anymore. That night, I slept without dreams. For the first time in years, I didn't wonder if they'd call, if they'd apologize, if they'd come around. I didn't need them to. I had already closed the door. They had been so eager to keep me outside of, and I had done it without bitterness, without spectacle, just presence, quiet, deliberate presence, the kind that says, I see now. And I've decided. The next morning, the house was quiet in a way that didn't ache. The kind of quiet that settles in after a long-held breath has finally been released. I woke without an alarm, without a purpose waiting, but also without the familiar weight pressing down on my ribs. The navy dress hung neatly on the back of the bedroom chair. I didn't put it away. I wasn't ready to fold it into the closet and pretend nothing had changed. It had become more than fabric. It had become proof that I could walk into a room built without me and still leave with everything I needed. I made coffee slowly, watching the sun stretch across the kitchen floor in thin lines. I didn't check my phone. I didn't wait for the apology that might never come. There was a calm in that, in not needing them to understand in order to feel whole. I had spent too many years anchoring my sense of place to people who saw my presence as optional. Now, I was learning how to take up space without asking first. Later that week, I visited the apartment complex on Maple Street. It wasn't grand, no garden, no porch swing, no fireplace, but it was clean, quiet, and the third-floor unit had a wide window that faced the town square. When the manager handed me the keys for a tour, I walked through each room with the care of someone saying hello to a new chapter. The kitchen was smaller, but the cabinets were sturdy. The bedroom caught the afternoon light, and the space just off the entryway would make a perfect reading corner. I didn't tell anyone I was moving. I didn't owe them that. I packed slowly over the next 2 weeks, one box at a time. I let go of things that had long stopped serving me, decorations chosen for someone else's comfort, furniture Robert and I had replaced 3 times over, a stack of holiday cards from people I hadn't heard from in years. I kept only what mattered: the photo of Robert holding Eli in the hospital, the worn copy of Little Women he used to read aloud, the ceramic lamp my mother gave me when I first moved in. Everything else could stay or be taken by strangers. I didn't feel guilty about it. The memories weren't in the walls, they were in me. The day I turned in the house keys, I stood in the empty kitchen for a while. The counters were bare, the light fixture above the sink slightly tilted, as it had always been. I ran my hand along the wall where Eli's height had once been marked in pencil. I didn't cry. I whispered goodbye, not to the house, but to the version of me who had waited too long at too many windows. The apartment felt smaller, but lighter. There was no echo of footsteps I didn't trust, no phone ringing with requests dressed as concern. Just me, my things, my time. The window became my favorite spot. From there, I could watch the town change color, pink mornings, amber afternoons, the soft blue hush of evening. I learned the names of the children who played in the square. I started volunteering 3 mornings a week at the children's library. No one asked about my past. They only noticed that I showed up. Thomas visited once, bringing chai in a paper cup and a box of lemon shortbread. He sat in the armchair by the window while I read aloud to a group of toddlers curled up on the carpet. He didn't interrupt, just watched. When I finished, he offered a quiet compliment about my voice, how it hadn't changed since the day I read to his 2nd grade class during a rainy lunch hour decades ago. I'd forgotten that memory. He hadn't. Rachel stopped by unexpectedly one Thursday afternoon. She held a bouquet of peonies from her shop, the same kind she used to tuck behind her ear as a child. She didn't ask to come in. She just stood at the door, uncertain. I let her in. We had tea. We didn't talk about the dinner. She glanced around the apartment like she couldn't quite believe it was real, that I had built something without their help or their permission. She left without asking questions. I didn't offer explanations. Nathan called once. The conversation was short. He sounded tired, his voice missing the usual certainty. He said my name too often, as though trying to remind me I still belonged to him in some way. I let him speak, but I didn't fill in the silences for him. He asked how I was. I said I was fine. He said they missed me. I didn't ask who they meant. The donations had been processed. The library had sent a thank you letter with gold lettering and a line that said the new literacy wing would break ground in early summer. They asked if I wanted to attend the dedication. I didn't hesitate. Of course I would. Robert's name would be etched in brass and hung on a wall where children gathered to fall in love with stories. That was worth showing up for. I didn't tell Nathan or Rachel about the ceremony. If they came, they would come as visitors. If they didn't, the day would still matter. It was not about them. It was about legacy, the kind you leave not through inheritance, but through intention. That spring, I walked more. I cooked less. I read longer. I smiled more often to myself than to others. It was not loneliness. It was solitude, and it was mine. The morning of the ceremony arrived with a breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and early blossoms from the square. I woke before my alarm, not out of nerves, but from something quieter, something like readiness. I dressed carefully, choosing the navy dress once more, not because it was expected, but because it had become part of the narrative I had reclaimed. It didn't feel like armor this time. It felt like acknowledgement. The fabric still held the memory of that evening, but no longer carried its weight. Eli arrived just before 9, tie askew, holding a bouquet of lilies that were slightly bruised from the walk. I didn't correct him. He offered them with a grin that made no attempt to cover the affection behind it. He had grown taller in the past year, though he hadn't noticed. His shoulders carried the quiet posture of someone who had learned to observe first, speak later. We walked to the library together, the sun low and gold behind the trees. The sidewalks had been swept, folding chairs lined in rows on the front lawn. A podium waited beside the covered plaque, and a table held paper cups of lemonade and small sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. It wasn't grand. It was enough. The mayor stood off to the side, straightening note cards. Miss Albright from the library handed out programs with smudged ink from the last-minute print. There were families scattered across the lawn, children chasing each other around the corners of the building, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months, but who greeted me with warmth that didn't ask questions. I didn't look for Nathan or Rachel, though part of me knew they might come. It didn't matter if they did. This day wasn't for them to redeem or ruin. It stood on its own. Miss Albright opened the ceremony with a short speech about books, about community, about how stories root us in ways we don't always understand until we've drifted too far to find them. The mayor followed, stumbling slightly through his lines, but recovering with a smile. When they called my name, I stepped forward without hesitation. The crowd shifted, a soft murmur moving through the rows. I didn't wave or nod. I simply stood there, looking out at the faces that had come, not for me, but for what the name behind the plaque had meant to this town. I spoke simply. I didn't read from a paper. I didn't need to. I talked about Robert, about how he had believed that reading to a child was an act of trust, that passing on a story was as intimate as passing on your name. I talked about the nights he fell asleep in the armchair, books still open, glasses slipping down his nose. I talked about the house where our children learned to listen, to wonder, to ask questions that didn't always have answers, and I ended with this. That legacy isn't about what you leave behind when you go. It's about what you build quietly while you're still here. When the cloth was lifted, the brass plaque gleamed in the light. It read, "The Robert Dillard Children's Wing." A few people clapped. Some wiped their eyes. Eli stood beside me, taller than I remembered, his hands in his pockets, like he wasn't sure what to do with pride. That's when I saw them, Nathan and Rachel, standing at the far edge of the crowd. They hadn't come close. They stood as guests, not family. Nathan wore a blazer too formal for the occasion. Rachel held a single white rose, already beginning to wilt. Neither spoke. Rachel offered the faintest nod. Nathan kept his eyes low, as if looking at the plaque too directly would demand a reckoning he wasn't ready to give. I didn't approach them. I didn't avoid them either. They were there. That was enough. Later, as the crowd dispersed and children wandered into the new wing, Thomas appeared beside me with 2 lemonades. He didn't speak until we were seated on a bench near the edge of the lawn. "To beginnings," he said quietly, raising his paper cup. I answered without thinking, "To choosing yourself." And that was the whole of it. I had chosen, not out of defiance or despair, but from clarity. I had let go not to make space for better people, but to make space for the version of myself I had been putting off too long. The ceremony didn't heal anything. It didn't need to. It acknowledged what had been done, what had been given, and what would now continue without asking permission. When I returned to the apartment that afternoon, the lilies Eli had brought were already leaning toward the window, following the light. I took off the dress, folded it carefully, and this time I placed it in the back of the closet, not to hide it, but to give it rest. Its purpose had been fulfilled. There were no calls that evening, no surprise knocks, just the sound of traffic softening as night settled, and the quiet joy of knowing that I didn't belong to anyone's silence anymore. The days after the ceremony moved slowly, not because time had changed, but because I had. There was no urgency to fill every hour, no silent expectation that I should be somewhere I wasn't. I still woke early, still made tea the way I always had, still watered the same 3 plants lined up on the sill, but there was more quiet between those things now. Not the kind that waits for sound, but the kind that allows room for breath. The apartment had settled into its own rhythm. The light fell differently in each room, depending on the hour, and I had come to know it like a pattern worn into old cloth. In the mornings, the kitchen glowed pale yellow. By afternoon, the reading chair by the window caught long, slanted streaks of warmth. Evenings were a soft gray hush that made everything feel like it belonged to no one but me. I had no list to manage, no calendar filled with obligation disguised as care. And yet I had never felt more occupied. The library had become a place of anchoring. 3 times a week, I walked the 4 blocks down Maple, past the coffee shop with the chipped blue awning, the bakery that always smelled of cardamom, and the corner bench where I once sat with my grocery bag full of lemons and the first clear suspicion that my family no longer considered me necessary. Now, I passed those places without bitterness. They were no longer tied to loss, only to memory. At the library, I shelved picture books and read to children who didn't know my last name and didn't care. I helped second graders sound out difficult words and watched teenagers hover near the poetry section, pretending not to notice I'd left a recommendation slip inside a worn copy of Frost or Angelou. I spoke little, but I listened closely. Children speak with their whole faces. They ask questions adults have long stopped daring to. It made me feel relevant in a way no invitation ever had. Thomas stopped by some afternoons, always quiet, never staying long. He brought stories more than updates, strange customer moments from the restaurant, forgotten facts about town history, once even a poem he had clipped from a newsletter. He never asked about Nathan or Rachel. He never brought up the dinner, the will, or the plaque. His presence was the kind that asked nothing and offered something simply by being there. We didn't make plans. We just let things happen when they did. One afternoon, in late spring, we walked through the town square where someone had hung paper lanterns in the trees. The light filtered through them in soft colors, casting gentle reflections on the pavement. Thomas said it reminded him of a night 30 years ago when the whole town lost power and we lit candles at the church for the Christmas pageant. I didn't remember the details, but I remembered the feeling, how silence can hold a room when it's shared instead of imposed. Rachel came by again one morning, earlier than before. She didn't bring flowers this time, just herself. She stood at the door, in jeans and a sweater, too warm for the weather, and said she had been walking without direction. I let her in. We didn't speak much. She looked at the framed photo of Robert on my bookshelf and asked how long I'd had it there. I said since the first night I moved in. She nodded and said nothing more. She stayed for just half a cup of tea. When she left, she hugged me too long, the kind of hug people give when they're afraid words will get in the way. Nathan didn't visit. He called twice. I let it ring once, answered the second time. His voice had changed, softer, less practiced. He asked how I was. I said I was well. He said he hoped I'd come for Thanksgiving. I said I'd think about it. I didn't lie. I just didn't promise. There was a strange peace in the uncertainty. I had lived most of my life believing that closeness was a kind of guarantee, that family meant automatic inclusion, but now I understood something else, that belonging isn't given by title or blood or tradition. It's built, chosen, sustained, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is no longer show up to be hurt. I didn't miss the house. I missed the feeling of being known in it, but I had come to see that the knowing could begin again, smaller, slower, but real. The apartment had taken on the shape of my days. The books on the nightstand shifted weekly. The curtains stayed open later into the evening. I no longer reached for the phone without thinking. I wrote letters again, not to send, just to say things out loud in ink. Somewhere between the library shelves and the quiet dinners with no centerpiece, I found myself in a space I hadn't planned for, a life not dependent on repair or return, a life not waiting for acknowledgement, a life that, for the first time in a long time, felt entirely mine. Summer crept into Willow Creek without spectacle. The square filled with the soft hum of lawnmowers and the distant laughter of children chasing sprinklers. At the library, the rhythm shifted with the season. School was out, and the reading room echoed with voices a little louder, stories a little sillier, questions more chaotic, but no less sincere. I found it easier now to sit in the noise without feeling overwhelmed. It wasn't noise aimed at me. It just was. And within it, I could disappear in the best way, present but untouched. My mornings followed a quiet pattern. Black tea, one slice of toast, a slow walk down the lane where the hydrangeas had started to bloom too early. I kept noticing details that once blurred together, the sound of birds under the eaves, the way the pavement warmed by 10, the flutter of a curtain in a window I passed each day but had never really seen. These were not grand revelations. They were small affirmations that the world continued without the need for explanation. I hadn't seen Nathan again. The messages had grown fewer. I didn't take it personally. Or maybe I had simply stopped arranging myself to be seen in his frame. I understood now that silence, when chosen, was not a punishment. It was a boundary. There's a difference between distance born from pain and distance born from peace. I had learned the shape of both. Rachel called more often, but always cautiously, like stepping barefoot across a floor she feared might creak too loudly. She never brought up the dinner, never mentioned the will. She asked how I was, what books I was reading, how the children at the library were doing. I answered simply. I didn't withhold, but I didn't expand. We existed in a gentle middle, neither rebuilding nor retreating, and I had come to understand that some relationships don't need to be repaired to be acknowledged. They just need to be redrawn. One afternoon, she asked if I needed anything. I told her no, not because I wanted to shut her out, but because I truly didn't. The apartment had everything I needed, and the rest I had let go of. I didn't need someone to pick up my groceries or fix a window or remember to check in on Thursdays. I needed space to decide who I was when no one was asking anything of me. Thomas remained a quiet constant. He never asked where the others were, never pressed about my choices. We walked sometimes. Other times, we sat in silence at the bakery near the corner, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching people pass, as if the movement of others somehow steadied our own stillness. He spoke in observations, not judgments. Once, he said the saddest people he knew were the ones who mistook being needed for being loved. I didn't respond then. I just looked at the coffee in my cup and felt the truth of it settle behind my ribs. There were moments, of course, when memory arrived uninvited. A recipe card in the back of a drawer, a voicemail saved out of habit, the soft ache of birthdays not marked, but they no longer dictated the day. They passed through me like weather, acknowledged, endured, and then gone. I didn't cling to them, and they no longer clung to me. The library sent a photo from the dedication, Eli and I standing beside the plaque, the children's wing behind us bright, with paper cutouts and hand-drawn posters. I framed it and placed it near the window, beside the ceramic lamp and the old clock that still ticked a little too loudly. It didn't feel like a monument. It felt like a page turned. I started writing again. Not letters, not even stories, just thoughts. Small fragments on the backs of receipts, in the margins of library calendars, on napkins left from the bakery. I didn't intend them for anyone. I just needed to see them exist. Sometimes a single line would sit with me all day, like a pebble in my pocket, grounding me. One evening, I passed by a family in the square, parents, 2 children, a grandmother trailing slightly behind with a bag full of snacks and folded sweaters. The kids ran ahead. The parents called after them. The grandmother didn't rush. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had learned not to hurry. For a moment, I felt something shift inside me. Not longing, not regret, just a soft awareness of how many shapes a life can take and how rarely we let it. I had stopped measuring time by what I was invited to. I no longer looked for signs that I was missed. What mattered now was not whether someone remembered me, but whether I remembered myself. The navy dress hung untouched since the ceremony. I hadn't worn it again, not out of reluctance, but because it had served its purpose. Some things don't need to be repeated to be remembered. Some moments don't need an encore. I had begun to understand that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of choice, and I was choosing each day not to return to a place where I had once waited to be chosen. I had chosen myself, and that, at last, had been enough. Fall arrived in Willow Creek as it always had, quietly, with the kind of change that didn't ask for attention. The leaves didn't fall all at once. They curled at the edges first, slowly yellowing, as if trying on a new version of themselves before letting go. The mornings turned cooler. I found myself adding a second blanket to the bed, reaching for the thicker cardigan I hadn't touched since spring. In another life, I might have marked the season by school calendars or family visits. Now, I marked it by light, how it shifted in the living room by 4:30, how the sun no longer climbed as high in the afternoon. These were the kinds of details that became enough when you no longer measured your life in arrivals. I still went to the library. Fewer children came in once school resumed, but the ones who did stayed longer. They lingered at the window seats, sometimes reading, sometimes just leaning into the silence with the trust only children carry. I shelved books, helped with the newsletter, repaired bindings with glue that always smelled faintly of vinegar. I didn't speak more than I needed to. I didn't stay longer than I wanted to. And yet, it felt like something solid, something chosen. Thomas had begun leaving things behind. A book with the receipt still inside. A scarf on the back of the chair near the window. A half-eaten muffin folded neatly into a napkin, tucked beside the sugar jar. He never announced his intentions. He just allowed them to take up space until they belonged. I didn't ask for explanations. I understood that companionship wasn't something you scheduled. It was something that grew in the absence of demand. Rachel called less often now, not out of neglect, but because whatever urgency had once driven those calls had settled into something calmer. When she did call, she asked about the weather, about the children at the library, about whether the tea shop had reopened after renovations. She never asked how I was, in ways that required more than I wanted to offer, and I appreciated that. Sometimes grace comes not through reconciliation, but through restraint. Nathan didn't call again, and I didn't expect him to. Not out of bitterness, just from having accepted that some distances don't need to be shortened. Some spaces need to stay open so that those who left them can choose, if they ever do, to return with intention. I didn't wish him harm. I didn't rehearse conversations in my mind anymore. There was a kind of healing in not holding the door ajar. The apartment had grown into me. I had added a few things: a new reading lamp, a framed postcard from Eli that he sent from his trip up north, a soft wool blanket in deep rust that looked too rich for its price tag. I didn't decorate for guests. I curated comfort. Everything had a reason for being there, even if the reason was only that it brought quiet joy. I cooked more now. Not meals meant for approval or gatherings, but simple food that filled the room with memory: lentil soup, apple bread, roasted carrots with rosemary. I wrote in the margins of magazines. I reread old novels, not for plot, but for the way the sentences landed differently this time. Some evenings, I sat by the window long after the sun disappeared, just listening to nothing in particular: the hum of traffic, a dog barking 2 blocks over, the wind finding its way through the trees outside the square. These weren't moments I'd once considered full. Now they held more than I knew how to name. I never told anyone what it felt like to be erased, not fully, because there are some stories that lose their meaning when explained. What mattered wasn't how they chose to make space without me. What mattered was how I had learned to stop waiting at the threshold. I didn't return to reclaim what had been taken. I didn't rewrite what they had written. I wrote something else, quietly, firmly, without apology. The library mailed me an invitation to the winter gala, a small event with cookies and readings and thank you notes tucked under each chair. They asked if I would say a few words. I said yes, not because I needed to be heard, but because I had something to say. On the night of the event, I stood beside the same plaque bearing Robert's name. Children ran past me, holding candy canes, their voices bright and rising above the string quartet in the corner. I didn't look for Nathan or Rachel. I didn't wonder if they would come. The moment wasn't shaped by who saw it. It was shaped by the fact that I had arrived. And that, I realized, was the quietest kind of revenge. Not absence, not bitterness, not victory. Just a life reclaimed, fully, without the need to announce it. I had not returned to the table. I had built another one, and I sat at it without asking who else was coming. Winter settled over Willow Creek with a kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. The mornings grew slower, the light more silver than gold. I added an extra layer beneath my coat and walked with my hands tucked deep in my pockets, not to hurry, but to linger. The trees in the square stood bare and proud, casting long shadows on the pavement. Everything had shed its colors, and in doing so, felt more honest. I found I liked this season best, not because of the holidays, not for the rituals or the gatherings I no longer attended, but for the way winter left no room for pretending. The branches did not decorate themselves. The ground did not hide its hard frost. It was a season that made you tell the truth, simply by showing up. At the library, the air carried the scent of cinnamon and glue. The children's wing had been decorated with paper snowflakes and crooked stars, most of them made with too much tape and proud hands. I helped a little girl repair a torn corner on her snowman drawing. She looked up and asked if I was a grandma. I smiled and said yes, but didn't offer names. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to coloring the scarf red. Eli came by more often now. He never said why, and I never asked. He brought books sometimes, or photos from his trip to the coast, or just stories about professors who still didn't know his name, but had finally noticed his work. He didn't treat me like someone fragile or wise. He just treated me like someone he liked being near, and that was enough. One afternoon, I watched him as he stood by the window, flipping through a book of poetry I'd left open on the armrest. He read a line aloud, softly, without looking up, and then laughed at himself, as if embarrassed by the intimacy of the moment. I didn't interrupt, I just listened. Later, after he'd gone, I marked the page with a slip of ribbon and left the book where it was, not for him to finish, just to know it was waiting. Rachel sent a card for the new year, a photo of her and Eli standing in front of a pine tree, arms linked, cheeks flushed with cold. She had written only 4 words inside. I see you now. I didn't know what she meant entirely, and maybe she didn't either. But I placed the card on the shelf beside the ceramic lamp and left it there. There was no mention of Nathan, no call, no note, no echo of the invitation he had extended months earlier. But I didn't find myself reaching for that absence anymore. It existed, but not in the center of things, more like a painting turned to face the wall, still there but no longer dictating the room. Thomas brought me oranges in a basket tied with twine. He said they came from a farm just outside town, where the trees had been coaxed through a harsh season with care and pruning. I placed the basket near the sink, and each morning I peeled one slowly, letting the scent linger on my hands. There was something grounding in the ritual, something that asked nothing and gave everything in return. At night I wrote more, not pages, not even paragraphs, just moments, a sound remembered, a gesture caught, a thought that arrived with no preface. I didn't call it writing. I didn't save them anywhere particular. I just needed to put them somewhere other than inside me. I began to understand something I hadn't before, not about them, but about myself, that for all the ways I had been erased, I had also once made myself smaller to fit the shape of what I thought love required. I had spoken gently when I wanted to ask more. I had given more than was ever returned. I had waited at windows and mistaken silence for safety. And then, one day, I had stopped. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but because something in me had remembered what it meant to live without measuring the worth of my presence by the comfort of others. I had stopped asking what I meant to them, and instead had asked what I meant to myself. The answer had taken time. It hadn't arrived all at once, but it had come in the form of steady mornings and children who didn't need my past to trust my voice, and a man who brought oranges without a reason, and a grandson who stood still long enough for the world to soften. And somewhere between the peeling of fruit and the shelving of books, I had stopped keeping count. The morning of the ceremony, I woke before the sun. The apartment was still and cool, the kind of quiet that doesn't demand attention but invites reflection. I sat by the window, wrapped in my cardigan, the steam from my cup rising gently as the first lines of gold broke across the sky. I watched as the light touched the corners of the room, the bookshelf, the small framed photo of Frank, the vase where fresh jasmine still stood from the market last week. There was no rush, no knocking, no waiting. I took my time dressing. The navy blue dress had been pressed days before, its fabric smoother than I remembered. As I fastened the simple brooch at the collar, I caught my reflection, not for correction, but for recognition. I look older, yes, but also steadier, more formed, like something that had been carved slowly, shaped by weather, and years and choices that once felt like sacrifices, but now felt like steps. At precisely 3, Liam arrived. His tie sat slightly askew, and he carried a bouquet of lilies wrapped in crinkled paper. He smiled when he saw me, not as a grandson trying to please, but as someone proud to walk beside me. I took his arm, not because I needed balance, but because he offered it with ease. The library stood quiet when we arrived. The crowd had not yet begun to gather. Volunteers moved chairs. Staff adjusted the podium. A few early neighbors waved from across the courtyard. The plaque remained covered, a soft breeze nudging the cloth as if eager to reveal what lay beneath. I stood at a distance, letting the moment settle around me. I wasn't nervous. I didn't rehearse. I had already spoken the words that mattered most, months ago, across a table no one expected me to approach. As guests filled the space, I caught glimpses of familiar faces, children from reading hour, parents I had once helped pick out chapter books, even Martha Jean in her signature teal scarf, waving with the same warmth she'd offered since the market that day. I also saw Mason standing at the back, hands folded in front of him, his gaze lowered. Clara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. They didn't come forward. I didn't call them. We had already met at the line that divided who I was and who I had become. Crossing it again wouldn't serve either of us. The speeches began. The mayor spoke of generosity. Miss Patterson spoke of legacy. And then I was called to the podium. I walked alone, the applause a soft hum around me. I didn't look for anyone in particular. I spoke as if to the space itself, to the air that had held me steady on lonelier days. I told them Frank had believed in the power of stories, not because they entertained, but because they revealed. I spoke of how he read every night, not for duty, but because he wanted our children to fall asleep knowing someone chose to be near them. I said that education wasn't just about information, but about presence, that a well-loved book could anchor a drifting child, and that this wing, this space, was not a monument. It was a beginning. When the cloth was pulled back, His name caught the light in a way that made the gold seem warmer. The Frank Hayes Children's Wing. Not a reward, not a repayment, a gift born from the part of my life that had been quiet too long and had finally spoken. Afterward, people lingered. Lemonade in paper cups, photos taken beside the new plaque, laughter from children who didn't understand ceremony but knew joy when they saw it. I stood by the wall of picture books, running my fingers along the spines, the paper jackets soft from use. And then I felt a presence beside me, Louis, holding 2 cups, one extended without a word. I took it, our hands brushing slightly. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't fill the space with praise or platitudes. He just stood there, watching the room with me, as if bearing witness to a moment that didn't need to be marked by anyone but ourselves. I looked over at him and smiled. Not a beginning, not a conclusion, just a chapter I hadn't expected. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the window. The jasmine had begun to bloom again, its fragrance wrapping through the air like memory. I poured a glass of water, placed the lilies in a vase, and turned on the small lamp in the corner. The living room glowed like it used to, not because it was filled with people, but because it finally felt like mine. I didn't check the phone. I didn't wait for another knock or call. I sat by the window, book in hand, and listened to the sound of spring moving through the trees. I didn't need forgiveness. I didn't need closure. I needed truth, and I had given it to myself. And that, at last, was enough.